Thank you. Hello. Good morning and welcome to the fourth meeting in 2013 of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off their mobile phones and Blackberries because leaving them in flight mode or on silent may affect the broadcasting system, and we wouldn't want that. Agenda item 1 today is subordinate legislation. This first item is for the committee to consider 2 negative instruments as listed on the agenda, and members should note that no motion to annul has been received in relation to these instruments. One on the marketing of bananas, Scotland, and the other on Shetland Islands regulated fishery orders. Are there any comments from members? No comments, then thank you very much for that item. Agenda item 2 is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's 2020 challenge for Scotland's biodiversity. And it allows us to take evidence in a roundtable format, which we enjoy normally getting a good flow of information. So what I'll do first of all is to go round the table and ask everyone to introduce themselves, and that will allow us, at least initially, to know who we're talking to and allow me to do the same. So I'm the convener, Rob Gibson, and Andrew's first.
I'm Andrew Midgley. I'm Head of Policy at Scottish Land and Estates.
I'm Jane Baxter, MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife.
Maggie Keegan, Head of Policy, Scottish Wildlife Trust.
I'm Paul Walton, Head of Habitats and Species for RSPB Scotland.
Claudia Beamish, MSP for South Scotland and Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change.
Matt Shardlow, Chief Executive of BugLife, the Invertebrate Conservation Trust.
Adam Smith, Director Scotland for the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust.
Richard Lyle, MSP Central Region.
Alison Hester, Head of Safeguarding Natural Capital at the James Hutton Institute.
Nigel Dawn, MSP for Angus North and the Mearns.
Deborah Long, Programme Manager at Plant Life Scotland.
Tony Hall, I'm Director of Policy and Regions at NFU Scotland.
Alex Ferguson, MSP for Galloway and West Dumfries.
Des Thompson, Principal Advisor on Biodiversity with Scottish Natural Heritage.
Jim Hume, MSP for South Scotland.
David McCracken, leader of our Sustainable Ecosystems team within Scotland's Rural College.
Angus MacDonald, MSP for Falkirk East and PLO to Richard Lochhead.
David Jamieson, Head of Parks and Green Space for City of Edinburgh Council.
Graham Day, MSP for Angus South and Deputy Convener of the Committee.
Thank you, everybody. To allow the discussion to flow, witnesses and members should indicate to me if and when they want to speak, and then I'll decide if you're good or bad boys and girls. But we need to try and make it flow. So please be patient and we'll try and bring everybody in. So to begin the questioning, the challenge for 2020 in biodiversity is varied. I wonder if there's a particular part of your interest that you think is going to make the biggest difference in our biodiversity changes in the next period of 7 years, that will really be able to be looked at the end of it as something which has really made a difference to the maintenance and improvement of Scotland's biodiversity. Who would like to start? All right. First of all, Adam Smith. It's all right. The sound systems work automatically.
Very impressive. In for a penny, in for a pound, and everyone that knows me around the table knows I'm not shy of coming forward. I think the vision that we would like to see addresses Albert Einstein's position that insanity, the definition of which is doing the same thing time after time and hoping for a different result. It's pretty manifest that we've not achieved our biodiversity targets to date in Scotland by doing what we have done so far. So the biggest single thing that I think Scotland could do is recognise that the vast majority of its land surface is managed, 50 to 60% for agriculture, 20% for sporting, 70% at the moment, and growing for forestry. And that we're not going to hit our conservation targets unless we actually engage actively and positively with land management. We can't deliver all of our biodiversity goals in protected areas. So a Scottish biodiversity strategy that has a really positive engagement with land management would be the overarching aim that I think we could actually suggest would bring benefits to Scotland. And that there are the techniques and the approaches that would allow land managers to do that.
Thank you. Deborah.
We had our biodiversity strategy launched in 2004. It's a great strategy. It's got a lot of very good things in it. And what we think would be, from a plant life perspective, would be the next useful step, really, is to step up on the delivery. In the introduction to Challenge 2020, we talked about step change. In order to do that, we need to be able to deliver. And that's going to include inspiring more people than are already engaged. It means the wider public, but it also means Parliament. And we also need to make it very, very clear what needs to be done and by whom. A lot of the responses to the consultation commented on the fact that it's not clear enough what needs to be done in the next 7 years to achieve the step change to start to conserve biodiversity and to halt the loss of biodiversity, which is what we're all aiming for. So I think there are two elements there. There's the inspiration element, and then there is also, let's be clear about the roles and responsibilities that we all have. I'm not just talking about the NGO sector, I'm talking about all of us, including the wider public, so that we can actually start to work together to make some great steps forward. There's lots of potential there, we just need to harness the energy.
Andrew Midgley.
I just wanted to support what Adam Smith was saying about engaging with land management. And your question, what was the single most important thing where you could look back and say this was really important? The thing that came straight to my head was advice. It's about engaging with land managers in a positive way and enabling them to help deliver for Scotland. And unfortunately, FWAG Scotland's demise has left a bit of a gap there. And there's been discussions about, in the future of the SRDP about the importance of advice, and it's something that most people have agreed about, is that we do need comprehensive advice structures that will help people deliver. I think my key point would be advice.
Okay, thank you. Johnny Hall.
Yes, just very quickly to pick up on the words of Adam and here and Andrew in terms of engagement and delivery and advice in many senses. The 2020 date on this particular vision is quite significant in my mind, because clearly 2020 also represents the end of the next programming period, not only for the next rural development programme for Scotland, but of course in terms of Pillar 1 support of the CAP as well. And that actually gives us a huge opportunity. Pillar 2, obviously the rural development programme, if we get the design and the delivery right, we can certainly realise a host of specific measures aimed at delivering biodiversity gains. But equally through Pillar 1, if the design and the delivery and the practicality is right for things like the greening component of Pillar 1 from 2014-15 through to 2020, then again, that will bring an awful lot of engagement over a significant area of Scotland if we can channel that in the right way. If we get it wrong, I think it could act as a disincentive, and I think, therefore, we need to tread very, very carefully as we go forward. But we have an opportunity here. Critical, of course, and this will be raised by others in due course, I'm sure, is funding. We are going to have to spend some money on delivering some of this. Engagement, advice, delivery, all comes at some sort of price, especially if we're looking at the scale and the context, catchment, ecosystem services, call it what you want. We have to think about the funding elements too.
David McCracken.
The point has already been sort of made by a number of the previous speakers, just to re-emphasise the importance of the common agricultural policy and the use of that policy to actually help drive the changes in land management that could happen either to benefit or to actually have an adverse impact on biodiversity will be crucial going forward. So it will be essential to use the CAP in both the Pillar 1 and the Pillar 2, the SRDP side of things. Wider countryside is extraordinarily important. We can't manage our protected areas without actually having appropriate management in our wider countryside as well. And people around this table will expect me to say it as well. We have a high proportion of Europe's high nature value farming system resource in Scotland, and we need to ensure that the CAP in all its guises actually provide sufficient and effective and appropriate support to that going forward. Maggie Keegan. And then
I'm pleased to see the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy is going to be aligned with the ACTU targets. The first strategic goal of the ACTU targets is to mainstream biodiversity across government departments and society, and I think that's absolutely crucial. We can't have biodiversity sidelined as it has been, so decision makers in the Scottish Government need to, so whether it be planning, we've got a new national planning framework coming out, we've got a realignment of Scottish planning policy, we'll have a new round of SRDP funding. It's crucial that whatever we've got in this strategy is delivered by other departments other than just the usual suspects, i.e. SNH, Forestry Commission, NGOs, etc. And we'd like the Minister to actually champion biodiversity.
Alison Hester.
Which I'd like to add to what's been said already. The first is indicators and the second is valuation of biodiversity. Both are critically important in our delivery of our biodiversity targets, and yet both have huge gaps in our understanding. And if we get it wrong, it could be very, very serious. So I would call for a very rigorous assessment of any indicators which we choose to use, and obviously a call for more research in terms of valuation, particularly of non-monetary benefits of biodiversity, because this is an area that is still very poorly understood. We need to get those right in order to deliver what we need to deliver.
Thank you. And Des Thompson.
Thank you. Before I make a few remarks, can I thank you and colleagues for having so many of us here for this discussion. We really welcome that, and the sort of remarks that have been made already are part of the conversation we've been having with many of our partners in developing the biodiversity strategy. I think echoing many of the remarks made, there are probably three aspirations we have for biodiversity in Scotland, and the first is this word mainstreaming. Adam at the outset mentioned working with land managers, but there's a whole gamut of people and organisations we want to work with, in particular in the health, education, transport sectors, really working with these sectors, and through working with these sectors, making a real difference for biodiversity, making it count greater. The second is trying to develop this ecosystem approach, really trying to manage nature in a much more holistic way, so that when we think about flooding, when we think about erosion, we manage nature, habitats and species and ecosystems much better to sustain the processes underlying these. And the third, something that perhaps Deborah Long touched on very pointedly, is really doing more for nature itself, for the habitats and for the species. And really, I mean, Scotland already punches far above its weight in terms of caring for nature, and we want to do far, far more so that Scotland's leading the way in Europe.
Indeed, I always think we've got to try and get in perspective where we are with many of the indicators and so on, and the nature of the language that we use about whether we are ambitious or whether things are sidelined. So I think we've got to be careful that we're not beating ourselves up entirely. We've got some more people who haven't spoken yet. So Paul Walton.
Yes, thanks very much. I agree with what you just said. There have been some major steps forward in terms of what Scotland has achieved for its biodiversity. The peatland story in the Flow Country is one that occurs to me. We have Caledonian pine woods. Now it seems to be actually expanding in area, probably for the first time in 4,000 years. So nature conservation and RSPB Scotland and other members of LINC have been really very closely involved with that. But there has, to a certain extent, been an impression that biodiversity is not a sort of core sort of economic business for the country among some public bodies. And I think if we could achieve that shift in emphasis to bring it right to the fore, in, for example, in the advisory community, having, delivery of biodiversity by, from agriculture and other land managers as absolutely front of mind, I think that would make a really big difference for us.
Okay, David Jamieson.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, I suppose everything that's been mentioned to date. I'm from a local authority background, so I could maybe give a local authority perspective on some of the issues that have been raised. We've heard about inspiration of people. Obviously, local authorities are at the heart of that, particularly in urban communities. We've heard about engaging with landowners. Obviously, local authorities are large landowners in their own right, and also influence quite strongly land management issues and land development issues elsewhere. We have a biodiversity duty. Many of us have a biodiversity duty, but I've heard very little of it, and I suppose I am the main officer in Edinburgh Council regarding biodiversity and its delivery. And I feel more emphasis needs to be placed on local authorities and other agencies and other bodies to make us deliver our biodiversity duty. Many reasons why we're not doing it, and I think one of the key ones is it's not the priority that it once was. Certainly in 2004 it was one of the big priorities that we all had an emphasis on to deliver, but it's been lost somewhat. I was quite surprised by the low number of local authorities that actually responded to the consultation, and I think that's really indicative of really the lack of priority that local authorities are taking around the subject. We don't have the biodiversity officers that we once had. We don't have the countryside rangers that we once had. We don't have the expertise internally, and increasingly don't have the resources to turn to others to give that expertise or support the many communities in our cities and rural areas who really want to engage with their natural environment. So I think taking a step back and looking why we're not delivering our duty across the board would be a good first step.
I want to move on to some questions so that other people can come in and develop some of these points. Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to look at the issue of raising awareness of biodiversity, because we're talking around the table about the state of play with biodiversity in Scotland, but there's a stat out there that says something like 75% of the population don't actually know what biodiversity is. And I wonder how we go about tackling that issue, because it's a fundamental issue. I mean, I would have thought that things like the Environment Linked Species Champions programme is quite a good starting point, if it's properly rolled out and we engage with school children. But if you compare it with climate change, by teaching the public, particularly children, about climate change, we are starting to see some behavioural change, and I wonder how we bring that over into the field of biodiversity.
Andrew Midgley, you want to comment on that? And then Deborah.
Okay. I wanted to make another point, but I'll save that for later if that's okay. I think there are a range of initiatives that already exist, and I suspect what you're hitting upon is the degree to which that they are successful. So there is work in different sectors, in education, in forest schools, initiatives, that sort of thing, which are all about getting people out to engage with nature. There's various high-profile initiatives, such as the Year of Natural Scotland, which are all oriented at trying to raise that awareness. But then bridging the gap to behaviour change is the critical question there. I think you can only start with getting people engaged in the first instance, and that's about highlighting what is good about Scotland and what we offer and what our successes are, and then the other organisations around the table that have a very strong presence in trying to get people engaged in doing new things, can take that forward.
Deborah Long.
I think this is an area where Scotland is doing very well, actually, and we should take due credit. The Scottish public has very strong cultural and social links with nature. There is a problem with the word biodiversity. It's a scientific word, but if we call it wildlife, if we call it nature, people engage very much with that. The link organisations, the ENGOs in Scotland, we depend on people getting involved in nature and wanting to support nature, because that's where our membership comes from. So the 500,000 members of the public that are also members of Scottish link organisations are there because they want to do something for nature, for wildlife. If you look at many of the publications that RSPB, SWT, Plant Life produce, we hardly ever use the word biodiversity because it is a turn-off, but we do talk about nature, we talk about plants, we make the language much more accessible. So I think it would be useful to separate the language issue from the fact that we do already engage very successfully with the public, and the public are generally inspired by nature and they want to do more for nature.
Paul Walton.
I'd just like to back that up entirely. So, we have, the RSPB in Scotland has a very active field teaching programme that engages a large numbers of teachers and pupils. We try to provide materials that are actually useful for teachers and feed into the curriculum. We have the biggest kids wildlife club in Europe operating. So we're really engaged with this, but the fact does remain, I do think you make a really important point, that despite these successes, there is an increasing disconnect between people and nature. And the key thing, if we really want to improve that, is simply to put people into contact with nature. So getting kids outside is a really critical part of this, and I would like to applaud SNH's recent attempts at making that change, because it really has been very effective in my part of Glasgow. But we really need to keep the momentum up on that, because if people don't have that connection, they won't know what Scottish nature is, and they will not be able to look after it in a sustainable way into the future.
David Jameson.
Yeah, I'd agree with Deborah. I mean, I think people are engaged, certainly more engaged perhaps than they've ever been in my time working in the biodiversity field. I mean, you've only got to watch television programmes, Autumn Watch, Spring Watch, massive numbers. So people are engaged and they're interested. I mean, we, like many of the organisations around here, get inundated with requests for help to take children out, to take groups out, to take individuals out at a weekend. It comes back to my point, though, we have less and less ability to support the demand that is really there. We're turning people down, if anything. We no longer run a lot of our environmental education programmes that we used to run only a few years ago. Our Forest Schools programmes, which is about educating teachers to get people out of doors, was hugely successful in Edinburgh, but again, it came to its funding end. And as we all know, it's very difficult to get funding to continue a successful programme. It's easy to get funding for a new programme. And there's myriad examples like that, really. So I don't think it's a lack of engagement. It's the word biodiversity, I understand that. But in terms of being inspired by nature and nature conservation, I mean, all the work we do in our parks and green spaces, when local groups get together, communities get together, the first things they talk about are bees. Well, once they've got past dogs and litter, they talk about bees and wildflowers and bats and birds. And this is what they have a great interest in. And they're very keen, very often, to create these type of features on their doorstep. And where possible, everybody's trying to help them with that. So lack of engagement is not an issue. Use of the word biodiversity perhaps is a semantic issue.
I'm going to take four more at the moment, and then there's a short supplementary, then other members will come in. So Maggie Keegan first on this point.
Yes, I was going to say we would probably say species richness for biodiversity, but my partner's a teacher, a maths teacher at a secondary school in Edinburgh, and I teach him about environmental issues that you can get into maths. And, in primary schools, I believe that, the curriculum for excellence works very well in getting children outdoors. When it gets to secondary school, you do have eco schools, but they only engage with a few of the... he used to run the eco school he's at James Gillespie's high school. It's getting all of the children at secondary school engaged with biodiversity or nature. It's quite difficult, and it must be in the curriculum, the appreciation and what it means and the value of it, because without that you'll only ever have the usual suspects engaged with it, those who want to be. You need to get all of them to appreciate it.
Bess Thompson, education.
Yes, well, Andrew mentioned the Year of Natural Scotland, and we have a gift of an opportunity here to really up the profile, raise our game in terms of promoting nature. And yes, there's a sort of core who are passionate about Scotland and passionate about nature, members of RSPB, SWT, supporters of plant life, etc. But we've got to go beyond that, surely. It's to go into the sort of education sector to reach people we ordinarily can't reach. The health sector, I mean, there's so much you can do in terms of improving people's mental welfare by providing them with greater access to the wonderful nature we have. And again, you know, if we could use the Year of Natural Scotland to do this, to have more people interacting with nature, getting more from it, feeling better about it, then I think you get the sorts of changes you were mentioning in relation to climate change. It's that step change where people suddenly realise that without nature thriving, close to them, accessible to them, we will be poorer as a nation. So it's that step change that we're trying to get to through this strategy.
Indeed. Alison Hester?
As my point's been well made, it's again stressing the need to have outdoor learning and biodiversity as an integrated part of the curriculum right the way through the school ages.
We'll ask the Cabinet Secretary for Education for some comments on that. Adam Smith. Yeah.
Adam. I was actually going to make a not dissimilar point and actually back up something that Scottish Natural Heritage is doing very well at the moment, which is to develop a curriculum tool with a wide range of land management organisations, including the GWCT and NFUS and the Royal Highland Education Trust, which will be available on the web as an access point. And this builds on the experience that we've had taking school children out. Royal Highland Education Trust do a superb job explaining farming. We partner them to go what we call beyond the farm gate and explain the conservation value that farming can actually bring when it's done well. Of course, we have enormous experience in delivering these messages at the Scottish Game Fair at Scone every year, where we see the appetite that the public has for understanding what land management is actually bringing in terms of the things that they see out on the hill. You know, most people still don't really understand that the heather moorland that so many of us cherish is a man-managed artefact. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't for investment and management. And I think that would bring me back to the other piece of awareness, which we've already touched on. We mustn't kid ourselves that one of the key bits of awareness is actually awareness amongst the management community as well. And this is the advice point that's already been made, and the point that actually Paul made very well as well, that we need to make sure that land managers are aware of their, you might say, ethical responsibility to have biodiversity as part of their operation, and the fact that it's not necessarily in conflict at all with their economic and food production objectives. You can do both. You can farm for crops in the middle of the field and farm for birds at the edge. And that kind of awareness raising is very important as well.
A brief supplementary, Graham, and then other members.
Not so much a supplementary, Career, just an observation. In the recent parliamentary debate, my colleague Alec Ferguson described biodiversity, or explained it as the balance of nature, and it strikes me from what we've heard today that perhaps every time the B word appears, it in brackets afterwards should be the balance of nature by way of explanation.
If I might suggest, call it the balance of nature.
Right, so that's a comment. Fine. If we can move on from there. Jim Hume, a question?
Yeah, it was a very specific point. It's one that I actually brought up in the biodiversity or better nature for Scotland debate, as we maybe should call it now. The European Commission, they adopted a biodiversity strategy, as they called it, with 6 targets. One was tighter control on invasive alien species. Now, we now see, of course, sudden ash death. I think Scottish Wildlife Trust have been particularly concerned, as many others have, about that coming into Scotland and the UK at a very rapid rate, mainly because perhaps inadvertently because of government policy. And it's not a criticism on this government, it's all governments have wanted to increase forestry, of course, which is laudable. Ash is an indigenous species, one with some commercial value, and it's a very good burner in the fire as well. But perhaps we've tried to increase forestry without having been able to have the supply chain of producing enough saplings, small plants, to actually prevent having to import, if we can call importing from Europe importing, plant life. I would just like to see if there's other views on that specific point.
So, we haven't heard from Matt Shardlow first. Give you a chance.
It's definitely very important that we take more action to restrict the sources of these invasive species, and I think we do need to look much more carefully at importation into these islands, because particularly with pot plants, we can bring in vast numbers of things that we don't really want here. And ash dieback's one example. The flatworms is another example. Harlequin ladybirds is another example. Killer shrimps. There's a whole stream of these things now coming into the UK. Demon shrimps as well, not just killer shrimps, also demon shrimps. Lots of things which actually can cause damage to biodiversity, damage to crops. I mean, there was a shipment of tree ferns from Australia imported, and that had 250 different species of invertebrate living in it, which the FERA estimated half could cause pest problems in the UK if they got out. So there are real problems with this, and it needs to be severely looked at. In countries like Australia and New Zealand, they don't allow you to bring this stuff in. So why is it that, just because we're part of the European Union, we have to import stuff into our country that causes huge pest problems? It's a big issue, and one Bug Life thinks we should be taking much more seriously, actually.
Paul Walton and then Des Thompson.
Yes, this is absolutely not a point of detail or a side issue in any way. The impact of invasive non-native species is one of the fundamental drivers of biodiversity loss globally. There is really no doubt about that at all. It's an extremely serious issue. Our West Atlantic oak woods, which are arguably the biodiversity pinnacle that we have in Scotland, they're unbelievably special. They're of massive global significance to mosses, to lichens, and indeed invertebrates as well. A very high proportion of the best sites are in unfavourable condition because of rhododendron invasion in those areas. Something we really have to do something about it. So, but the take-home message is that we all, collectively, that's everyone in the world, has to be much smarter about the way we move animals and plants around the planet. There is a forthcoming EU legal instrument which is due to be published now. Now that's going to be a draft. It's going to work its way through to be either an EU directive or a regulation. This is... Invasive non-native species is the only big driver of biodiversity loss that doesn't have dedicated EU law at the moment. And I just think everyone should be aware of this as a huge one-off opportunity to really do something about this, because it's not, Scotland can't do anything about this just on its own. It really is about all of our trading partners. It's about what we export as well as a critical part of it. So it's a brilliant point, and it should absolutely be raised here. And I will say that the legislation that Scotland has in place under the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act that this Parliament brought in actually leads Europe. I mean, I've been involved in the EU discussions for the past 5 years, and it's pretty clear that we are well ahead. And the Scottish Working Group on Invasive Non-Native Species has been a very productive working group from the NGO's point of view. So we're doing well. We just need to keep up that momentum, and we need to input where we can to progress that European directive.
Des Thompson, Alison Hester, Johnny Hall and Alec Ferguson.
Well, just briefly, and just to add to that and to support absolutely what Paul said, first of all, I mean, invasives are one of the greatest global threats for biodiversity. So it's going to take a global effort to hit it. In Scotland, invasives cost us about £240 million a year. So that's £250 million per year. And the key to reducing that impact is prevention. It's trying to look ahead. It's trying to stymie out these invasives. That's the core of the strategy that we're taking forward, preventing the introduction, the spread of invasives.
It's a sobering thought. Alison Hester?
Yes, it's a good follow-on actually from what Des has just said. One of the critical points is early identification. I think it's inevitable that these things will come in, just because of the way we live globally now. But ash dieback is a very good example of where we are only acting when it is already a problem, by which point it's probably impossible to deal with it. Early warning is absolutely critical, perhaps when there's only been 1 or 2 locations of something. At that point, we have historically been very bad at acting. If we did act at that point, when there are only 1 or 2 discoveries, that's the point at which we can do something about it, and relatively fast and relatively cheaply. At the point we do act now, it's too late. So that's what I would press for, is early warning and early action before it's actually a problem, and we can learn globally about that. We should have some global links through to identifying, for example, in the Ash Dieback case. In Denmark, there was a very good example that had already happened. We could learn from that and say, right, we found 1, 2 locations, we're going to act now.
Thank you. Johnny Hall.
It's largely to reiterate the points that have been made already. Thinking about the whole issue of invasive non-native species, obviously that drew my attention to the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act, which Paul's referred to. But equally, in a sort of land management and the water environment, there's the Water Framework Directive and its implementation in Scotland. And clearly there are critical sections of that which deal with alien species and so on and so forth. I suppose my comment is more by way of a question. I'm not so sure whether we've got our priorities right on some of these things. We have the tools, but are we using them as effectively as we possibly could do? And maybe the tools do need a wee bit of refining or honing if the issue is, and I agree, the issue is far more about prevention rather than cure. We seem to be able to have contingencies put in place pretty quickly once something arises, once a problem arises and so on and so forth. And we're pretty good at that, particularly with animal health issues as they creep further north and so on and so forth in an agricultural context. But I think that the real key is actually the prevention in the first place. And whilst it's very difficult in an open trading economy such as Scotland, within the UK, within Europe and so on and so forth, nevertheless, efforts have got to be made and should be made in all sorts of sectors.
So we're needing the international organisations that deal with free trade to be thinking about the cost of free trade. Alex Ferguson.
Thank you. It really follows on from what Alison Hester was saying. Early detection, absolutely. I have no argument with that at all. But I also wonder whether we don't need to think again about what we do when we have failed to detect early. And I use 2 examples. One is a very local one to me, which is American signal crayfish, which is rapidly taking over the waterways of Dumfries and Galloway. And the other is Japanese knotweed, which is doing the same. And there comes a stage when they're no longer invasive. They become part of our scenery, part of our life, part of our biodiversity, dare I say. And I wonder whether we need to look again at once we fail to detect early, once they're here, how we approach these issues, because it seems to me that we still take a preventative approach to something that's already arrived in our landscape. And I don't think that is satisfactory. And certainly experience locally would suggest that it does have serious impacts, not just on biodiversity, but on socio-economic impacts, on local economies, and all that sort of thing. And I just wonder if anybody wanted to comment on whether we need to go one further than just early prevention. And look
as people are coming in now, you might take on board that point, Deborah Long.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on something Alison said, but I'll make a contribution to that point. One very good feature of the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act that Paul mentioned is that actually does give responsibility to agencies for groups of species. Paul's got a very good example of an issue with New Zealand pygmyweed at an RSPB reserve, where the issue got bounced around, and it meant that we lost time because there was no clear lead to immediately go to try and address the problem. So that's one very important mechanism that we do have in place. Obviously, the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act is a fairly recent act, but there is a mechanism there that could be used. One point I wanted to make in relation to Alison's point about early detection is that one thing we vitally need in order to be able to detect at an early level is taxonomic expertise. And in Scotland, particularly in terms of fungi, lichens and bryophytes, we're losing taxonomic expertise. So, for example, the mycologist with the expertise in Scotland retired from the Royal Botanic Gardens 7 years ago. I think it was roughly 7 years ago. And he has never been replaced. So we do have a gap at the moment in people who are expert enough to be able to identify these species at an early enough stage. There are apprenticeship schemes, so we are beginning to train people up, but we do have a significant gap at the top at the moment in those 3 areas of taxonomy.
Maggie Keegan?
Yes, a couple of comments about Ash Dieback. The first one is to say that, the furore over it in this country and, in the UK as a whole and the media coverage shows just how much the public care about, what goes on in the countryside and their wildlife. And the other thing that was very noticeable when I went to one of the initial stakeholder meetings run by the Minister was how little research had been done in other countries about the causes and the whys and wherefores of ash dieback. And I asked the Chief Exec of Forest Research why this was the case. And he sort of intimated, well, in other countries, they've got so many different tree species and they've got, you know, the species-rich habitats that actually losing this ash tree wasn't so important to them. Whereas to us, you know, in Scotland, we lose that from a woodland. It's what do we replace it with? And you'll notice the difference. And it's talking about having these sort of resilient species-rich habitats so that can bounce back from perturbations such as this. And I don't think we're there yet. And that's probably true for a lot of invasive species that come in. They can actually get in because they're replacing a gap that exists.
Adam Smith.
Sorry, I'll get the hang of this eventually. I do apologise, Mr. Chairman. Like a complete sook, I was going to actually pick up on the point that Mr. Ferguson raised, and I think I actually used the phrase in your debate contribution that we're doomed. And there is a feeling
probably weren't told.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that's exactly the point that I was going to back up, which is your point is well made. What do we do when we have the problem? And this is actually a point where community engagement actually may well be very important. The example that I think of is mink control, and the GWCT developed a technique. We built it on traditional gamekeeping techniques, but we built a technique for tracking the presence of mink in such a way that communities could actually do this up and down their river systems. When mink were detected, then they could actually be trapped and removed to the benefit of water voles, which of course are one of our most attractive and cute and fluffy biodiversity action plan species. The message coming out of this is that actually communities can have a very important role in both reporting and monitoring the presence of alien invasives. And I applaud some of the things actually that have been happening south of the border, dare I say it, for utilising modern technology, apps, which people can actually quickly record the presence of sightings of unpleasant species and report that back to a central point. And rapid reporting will enable us then to deploy solutions. And indeed the success that's been had with controlling mink and enhancing water vole populations in the Cairn Gorms just goes to prove exactly what Mr. Ferguson said. We're not doomed.
Very good. I'm glad to hear it. Let's see the reporters know that we're not all doomed. Jim Hume.
To round off that debate, I think I started there on in a way invasive alien species and the fact that ash. I mean, ash, as Maggie Keegan rightly said, is a very important tree to Britain and perhaps Europe. It's just part of a larger matrix of trees, if you like. Interestingly, we were discussing flooding before this debate, but ash is also used, of course, to reinforce riverbanks in Scotland. So if the ash goes, then we could see some erosion in the future. So we maybe are all doomed after all. But I would just like to maybe get a view from one or two people. If we think ash has maybe been brought in here, it looks like from perhaps the lowlands of Europe, because we've not actually been able to produce enough saplings, as I said in my initial point. So would it be helpful if governments in their deliberations about increasing woodland cover, especially when it's indigenous ones, that perhaps that should be indigenous trees that are used to prevent that local produced stock, which not only, of course, saves any risk of disease coming in, but also in cross-pollination with our own stock to save our own sort of genetic species of ash, which I'm sure is slightly different to European stock or other stock.
I think you've answered your own question, really. It's a fair point, yes.
I agree, yeah.
He agrees with himself. Dick Lyle, you had a question or a comment?
No, I think I've got a question. Well, I've actually got two, and I don't believe we're all doomed, but during the debate I actually remembered a film which I saw a number of years ago, and I don't know if anybody has ever seen it, Soylent Green, by Charlton Heston, which I'll not give away the ending, but it was quite a poignant film. But I really want to come on to the point which I wanted to cover was the factor of we're now getting comments and questions in regards to the state of the bee population. And I think, Maggie, I was directed that you know quite a lot about this. But basically, the concern of how, bees at the end of the day help our biodiversity or our nature and cross-pollination, etc. So what is the problem? Last year we had a visit to a bee farm. There weren't any bees there because they were all out, hired out into fields. But basically, it concerns me when you read in the papers that a lot of bee populations actually are disappearing. And maybe comments in regards to that.
Yes, I'll say a little bit, but also Matt Shardler from Bug Life has been running a campaign from 2009, so I'd like him to give some of the background information. Obviously, Scottish Wildlife Trust has become involved in this issue this year, and there's 3 important publications in Science and Nature which suggest that neonicotinoids at sublethal doses are harmful to bees. Not just honeybees, but also bumblebees. We don't know the effects on other insect pollinators because nobody's doing any research out there on that subject. Talking about being all doomed, I can say that in English. Insect pollination is worth about 43 million to the Scottish economy, and honeybees only pollinate a few of the Scottish crops, our fruits. Strawberries, raspberries, apples, other fruits actually require bumblebees and other insect pollinators. So it's more than just about honeybees. We believe, it's a devolved issue. Scotland could actually lead the way and place a moratorium on these using these insecticides. What we need to do is I think we're becoming to the end game of these neonicotinoids, but we need to look at a way that, what a farmer's going to use. That's the big question. We're not saying, automatically stop and farmers have nothing to use. The Scottish Government should be looking at ways to see what else we can use in the future. But I'll let Matt say something if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Who speaks? Sorry.
Thank you very much. As Maggie and earlier Paul have said, ecosystem services and the value of wildlife is a really important issue, and there's nothing clearer than the value of pollination because it's quite easy to measure. The crops get pollinated, the wildflowers get pollinated. So there's a value there, 43 million in Scotland, which is a really important part of the economy, directly down to insects. The difficulty we've got is that wild insect populations, pollinators, are in general trouble. So whether you're looking at moths or butterflies or bumblebees or even ground beetles, you're looking at declines in about 2/3 of the species and about a quarter to a third going up. So this is UK statistics, unfortunately, but generally the principles are most things going down. Also, in terms of EU, there's been EU work looking at bees and hoverflies, which has shown over twice as many of the species going down as going up. So the trend here is very bad and quite rapid in terms of the length of time that these relationships between plants and pollinators have been evolving. And there's been growing concern about neonicotinoids, and it's important to know about neonicotinoids that they function very differently to other insecticides. So they're applied usually to the seeds, which means that the farmer has automatically applied the pesticide to their crop before they've actually planted it or before they've detected a potential problem. And because it's on the seed, it then goes into the tissues of the plant and stays in the tissues of the plant for the entire life of that plant, and also comes off into the soil as well. And as the plant grows, it produces pollen and nectar. And of course, the nectar and pollen feeders then come and feed on that. So in trying to do their wonderful service for us and for wildlife, the pollinators are getting then affected and poisoned by the neonicotinoids. And increasingly over the last few years, more and more research has been pointing to a much greater risk from neonicotinoids than was originally assessed. And I think Honeybees has been a large bit of concern. They're quite comparatively well covered in the tests, and there's been comparatively large amount of research. There's been appallingly little on other pollinators, and really just this summer a real big game changer was when Dave Goulson at Stirling University and his team there published a paper on bumblebees, which showed that at the sort of levels of neonicotinoid pesticides that you find in the flowers of crops, at those sorts of levels, it was causing an 85% reduction in the number of queens that bumblebee colonies were producing. And it's very difficult to imagine that not having a big impact on wildlife, if you're knocking out that many bumblebee queens. So we've been campaigning for quite a while now to suspend these chemicals until they can be shown to be safe. And the European directive, the Plant Protection Products Directive, is based on the precautionary principle. So if you've got enough evidence, and we think we have, we've got over 30 reports in the last 3 years that show greater levels of risk than we'd suspected. When you have that situation where the evidence is building up, we believe it's time for decision makers to step in and take action before it gets to the point where we've already lost that thing that we value. So that's where we're at the moment. I think it would be very good to see some action from Scotland looking at this issue, maybe undertaking your own review of the science. And there are some areas, like for instance the use of neonicotinoids by local authorities in municipal plantings, for instance, that politically you could take a lead on trying to understand where the chemicals are being used with public money, and whether that can be reduced to give a greater opportunity for pollinators in urban areas and in the countryside in Scotland.
Farming involves quite a lot of public money as well. So it would be useful if Johnny Hall responded at the moment. And Maggie made the clear point that it's a matter of finding a means to change that we're talking about here. It's not an accusatory situation.
Absolutely.
It's a build-up of evidence.
That's exactly what I was about to say. I am grateful to colleagues for setting out what is a very sensitive and very difficult situation in a very objective way. I think from an agricultural point of view, clearly bees are hugely significant to the interests of Scottish agriculture, and we're never going to deny that. In fact, quite the reverse. We want to see an absolutely thriving bees population for all the benefits that would bring. But equally, on the one hand, we have, as it was put, the value of pollination. But equally, from a food production point of view, there is a huge value in applying effective and cost-effective pesticides. But of course, they have to be safe pesticides. And safe, your boundaries of safe could be defined in all sorts of different ways. Scottish agriculture, along with European agriculture, has to operate to all sorts of very stringent requirements. And it's not a cheap hobby, applying pesticides. So farmers aren't just liberally throwing these things around for fun, far from it. And if they could avoid using pesticides at all, they would do, because it is just an additional cost into production systems. So I think we are in a dilemma as an industry, and I think we've recognised that. We've taken on board. Clearly things are happening at a European level, and they will happen at a UK, Scottish level as a consequence as well. And we as an industry have to sit up and take note. But I think the plea then goes out in some respect to beyond just the environmental interest and the agricultural interest and into arguably the research interest, because we must start to look at alternative approaches. And that's not just alternative pesticides, but it's different forms of crop systems management and so on and so forth. Agriculture's been here before in many senses. We go through periods of production versus environment challenges, and ultimately there is some trade-off, and some of those trade-offs do become unacceptable, and therefore we have to think again. And I suspect this is a classic example of the industry, but also the advice and the awareness and the research that goes to the industry as well, being much better informed and ready to take more action. You mentioned public support and public funding into agriculture. Absolutely take that as read. But equally, in order to deliver safe, wholesome food products, which are the bedrock of a huge food and drinks industry in Scotland, as well as being active agricultural management of the vast majority of Scottish landscape, then we have to find some sort of compromise whereby efficient and effective, and I'm going to use the phrase, sustainable intensification of agriculture can take place.
Now, we have a number of people on this, and we'll bring in Maggie just at the end of it. But David Jameson, you know, the challenge to local authorities, Adam Smith, wider issues, Angus MacDonald, and then Maggie Keegan to round up this particular little bit. Okay?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, there's no doubt from what we've heard and what we all read in the media and elsewhere in the research documents that the decline of bees and other pollinators is one of the biodiversity issues of our day, really. Certainly, I think, though, it brings opportunities in the sense that it's also captured the imagination of people. We talked earlier about engaging people. Bumblebees, honeybees, all the bees are a charismatic species, increasingly so. I don't know how many bee cafes and bee hotels we've built with schools and other groups in Edinburgh, but they're really popular, and people recognise the link now, which perhaps a few years ago wouldn't have been the case. So I think if we are to look to engage people around biodiversity, I think pollination is an area that we could put some emphasis on, and maybe change some of our policy and thinking. Urban areas probably increasing in pollinating species. We're doing some research at the moment with Edinburgh University and Bristol University to determine what the best urban habitats are for pollinating species. And we've got some historical issues. So the Allotments Acts actually don't allow you to keep bees in an allotment because they're classed as livestock, and you're not allowed to keep livestock in an allotment. We've had a few surreptitious beekeepers and really turned a blind eye, but what we're actually trying to do in Edinburgh is overturn that and really allow the active keeping of bees in an urban environment. And also on roofs, green roofs, you see increasingly the use of the urban habitat now, you know, for bees and other pollinating species. So yes, I know there's a lot of things that need to happen out there to turn this around, but I think there is also a wee opportunity in there to really use this plight to really get over the importance of biodiversity and the interlinkages between species and habitats.
Thank you for that. And now to the wide open spaces, Adam Smith.
Well, wide open spaces, back to the fields, and really I was going to pick up on the issues that Johnny and Matt and Maggie were picking up on. And I think they laid out very neatly the point of view that we need food and we need biodiversity and pollinators as well. And Johnny used the phrase the sustainable intensification of agriculture. There may be a solution, or at least something of a mitigation, in the sense that we could have the sustainable intensification of conservation. And if there's something that this committee may wish to consider at a future debate, it's not for the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy necessarily, but for the SRDP reform and CAP reform issues, the pollen and seed-rich mix option for our margins may be a significantly important mitigating factor for some of these issues. If we could get that one thing incorporated into our future Scottish agricultural environment prescriptions, that would probably be enormously useful. We've done some research on this which certainly suggests that it does increase pollinator abundance to a marked degree. We have to be slightly cautious because we've also found that it may be sucking some of the pollinators, hoverflies and bees, actually off the hedges, which is a curious twist. So if you plant it close to hedges, you may get reduced pollination rates on your hedge, but enhanced pollination and enhanced perhaps survival of the pollinators actually in the mix. But there are ways of potentially managing this difference, and it comes down to this idea of farm the middle of the field for food and farm the edge of the field for biodiversity. I use the word.
Thank you. Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. I'm glad that the discussion has moved on to neonicotinoids. It's clear the issue has been getting more and more coverage in the farming press in recent weeks and months, and it would seem that these pesticides are clearly causing significant damage out there, and I'm glad it's being acknowledged by the agricultural industry. It's just a brief question, Convener. Could the panel, perhaps Maggie or Matt, identify which countries in Europe have already introduced a moratorium or indeed a ban on neonicotinoids?
There's 4 countries which have already put bans in. None of them, except Slovenia, I think, are complete. So Slovenia is a pretty complete ban. Italy has banned certain products because of fears and damage to honeybee populations several years ago, and that's been implemented and maintained through their legal system. France has banned a number of products on sunflowers particularly, including a very recent product last year which has been authorised here but was automatically banned, restricted in France. And Germany has also put in place certain restrictions on the uses of neonicotinoids. Just last week, the Dutch government voted in Parliament to ask the EC to put in place a full moratorium across all neonicotinoids. And the EC is looking to respond to that, and they've said they're going to respond with some legislative attempt at, they said partially applying the precautionary principle, which is, I think, better than not applying it at all. And so we look to see how that's going to work out. But Holland, the Dutch government may move to ban it unilaterally if it doesn't happen across other countries as well.
I'll go back to Johnny Hall in a minute about the crops affected, but David McCracken, Johnny Hall, and then Maggie to sort of finish up this particular part.
It was just to add to that point that the European Commission are considering this issue, or the Dutch proposal, to actually introduce an EU-wide sort of consensus on how they actually deal with that. They're dealing with that tomorrow in Brussels, I believe, from the information I've got here. And currently, Matt is right in the range of countries that he's indicated that have already put some form of restriction in place. And in addition to that, Germany, Austria, Poland, the Czech Republic and France are currently supporting the Dutch delegation's request that there be an EU-wide sort of consensus on how the EU would actually tackle that.
Can I come to Johnny Hall and think about the particular crops that are affected by this? If you could just give us a summary of that just now, it would help, I think.
Well, it would certainly impact significantly on major arable interests in Scotland, particularly in terms of cereals, oilseed rape and potato production and so on. As well as, obviously, there's other pollination issues in soft fruits and so on, which are clearly important in some parts of Scotland. I think our position on this is, whilst we recognise, as I said earlier, we recognise the challenge and the issues and so on, nevertheless, jumping straight into an outright ban on such products nevertheless carries a cost, and we have to look at the real impact of that across Scottish Agriculture PLC, indeed the wider interest of Scotland. Therefore, we need to find some sort of way forward which satisfies the interests of both biodiversity and food production. And that's not going to be easy, but I don't think we should jump to any knee-jerk reactions and conclusions.
Jim Hume, on that point.
On that very point, I mean, I have a farming interest, but I was up in the hills, so not much use for arable sprays, etc. But how long is neonicotinoids, to ask the daft question, how long has neonicotinoids been used in Scotland for agriculture, and what was used before? Is there an alternative, in other words?
Maggie?
Well, they were introduced about 1994. And actually, if you look at oilseed rape yield, before they were used, there's records from the 1980s to up until now. Actually, the yield hasn't gone up. So whatever was used before, the yield has stayed pretty much the same. So they're not the golden bullet. Obviously the farmers need something, but it doesn't mean to say that they actually increase the yield over what was used before. Do you want me to go further, or should I just...
One or two things, I think, just before we finish. Yeah. Claudia, did you want to come in on that? Great, so we can start off with you in a minute. But Dave McCracken, first of all.
This is not my own particular area of expertise, but I've taken some advice from some colleagues. So just to add to your question there, two things I think are important, and we in SRUC accept that there is increasing evidence starting to emerge about the adverse impacts of nicotinoids. But our current position is that until there's more evidence that if they're used appropriately, our position is there's no compelling evidence at the minute that there's a major issue, but we recognise that things are actually moving swiftly from at both a European and a UK level in terms of additional evidence. The 2 points I wanted to make was the current use of those chemicals in Scotland. They are actually targeting pest species that would be much more difficult to target via any other way, because they get into the crop so quickly and they start damaging the crops so quickly that you would need quite a very strong monitoring strategy to actually do that. And the second point my colleagues had made to me was the previous seed treatments that was available, Lindane, when it was banned for quite correct environmental reasons. At that point, some of the pests that we now see and we're using the current suite of insecticides for are actually arose subsequent to Lindane actually being banned. And the third point I would just want to make, I appreciate the debate we've actually had has been specifically on the insecticides, but from the honeybees and the wider sort of pollinator point of view, I wouldn't want anybody going away from here thinking that if we had a moratorium on its use in Scotland tomorrow, that would solve all the pollinator problems. Because going back to what we started off the debate, the discussion this morning was, there's a whole host of additional land use and land management issues that are also contributing to the fact that the pollinators don't have sufficient resources out there in order to maintain their populations and their life cycles.
That's a very important point. Matt, a small point in this.
Yeah, just to add on that as well, the other bit of evidence is to look at the countries where they have banned different neonicotinoids, and in neither France nor Italy, where they've been monitoring this, have they seen declines in the productivity and the yield rate. So they've managed to find other ways of doing it, changing cropping patterns, using different chemicals to get around not having neonicotinoids to use when they've had to.
And Maggie, any final points on this before we move to the next?
The first thing I should have said right at the beginning was I want to thank the committee for considering this in this session. So thank you very much for that. The other thing to say, I'm quite heartened by that the farmers, I mean, obviously we need to find solutions, and, I'd urge the Scottish Government to do that. The third thing is that the Scottish Government has got a new Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor Louise Heathwaite, who advises on rural and environment, and I would strongly recommend that she speaks to the scientists who've carried out a lot of this research, Professor Goulson and Dr. Connolly, one's at Stirling, one's at Dundee, and they have got a whole host of knowledge, and I recommend that I speak to those, and hopefully in the future we will have a better, sustainable system of cropping that is good for the farmers and good for our wildlife.
Well, our committee will take this issue seriously and take it forward, and this is, of course, is just an introduction to the subject, so we will be following it through in a balanced fashion as possible. So on to another area with Claudia Beamish.
I don't know if this is an appropriate time or if there are other land there are other land issues in relation to biodiversity, but I would like to, at some point in the proceedings, seek the views of the panel who's here today at the round table on marine ecosystems, dare I say marine biodiversity, and particularly in relation to the different interests that are sometimes competing with and sometimes working in harmony with marine biodiversity. So I don't know if it's a time to seek views on that now, or if we want to go on with land issues.
Entirely appropriate. We've got till 11:30, because we need to do other business as well. So if we can have a session on this just now, Claudia's question, with room for 10 minutes at the end on another land-based issue. So the marine biodiversity. So that's Paul.
Yes, thanks very much. In the Northeast Atlantic over the past couple of decades, there's been a 70% reduction in the biomass of zooplankton. And these are the little, often microscopic animals that graze on phytoplankton, the plants, the primary producer in the marine environment. And they are the absolute linchpin in marine food chains. And what appears to be happening is growing scientific evidence that as sea surface temperature warms, some organisms breed queuing on temperature change, and some breed queuing on the way day length changes. And the sea surface temperature has increased by about 1 degree C, and that has knocked the timing of the food chain. So marine biodiversity is really under immense pressures from incredibly intractable threats. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The way that conservationists tend to respond to these things is, you know, you can either sort of wring your hands and gnash your teeth and say, oh, we're doomed, or you can actually try to do something to improve the conditions for the wildlife and the biodiversity as we have, using the methods that we have at our disposal. And in the RSPB's experience, this really can work. It's a bit like when you've got a kind of a clapped out car. You're not entirely sure what the problem is, but if you kind of put a new battery in it and tweak some other bits of it, you can, in my experience, you can often get a bit more life out of the thing. This is a climate change-driven effect. In our opinion, I think there's very good evidence for that. That's, at best, going to be a very long-term thing we can do about it. But what we can do is we can get conservation mechanisms working in the marine environment now. And for that, we have this Marine Protected Areas agenda, which I'm sure the committee has discussed on a number of occasions. So this is required under European law, just as SSSIs are required to be designated on land. That, however, is really incomplete. It's incomplete, particularly from the RSPB's point of view, and other linked members in terms of some of the mobile species, in particular seabirds, which really, in our view, are not adequately covered by it. Now, seabirds are the top predators in the marine environment, because they're at the end of the food chain. And these effects that are happening down on the plankton are beginning to filter through on the seabirds, and we have long periods of breeding failure. In our internationally important seabird colonies, Scotland has a very high proportion of all of Europe's seabirds. And they are in a bad way, make no mistake. The breeding performance is low, not just for a year or two, which long-lived birds can cope with, but for long periods. And as a seabird biologist, it is actually heartbreaking for me to go and visit some of the colonies I worked on in the early 90s in Shetland, and to witness the losses that we've seen at them. It is really incredibly striking and very moving. So we need to get protected areas sorted out in the marine environment, and we need to get seabirds in there as well. The response to this has been, okay, well, marine protected areas, seabirds will be dealt with under the designation under European directives, special protection areas. At the moment, there isn't a single site in place to protect seabird foraging areas. The RSPB is very heavily involved with tracking seabirds to find out where they go, where they're actually foraging, to identify those hot spots. We look forward to that information being fed through into the SPA system, but we also are aware that the pattern that we're beginning to see shows that we really are going to need not just the big hotspots protected, but other areas protected as marine protected areas where the food supply for marine top predators is encouraged and protected and managed for, to cope with the situation that they have in varying conditions in different years, because the animals go to different areas in different years. So the idea of protecting the best areas is really what we need to start to look at really seriously for the marine environment. And we're slightly concerned we're not getting there yet. So, for example, the Firth of Forth is one of the most important sand eel areas in the country. It's one of the best known areas for sand eels in the world, and yet it seems to be being missed. So we have a groundbreaking Marine Act in this country. We look forward to what we think is an overdue national marine plan, which will help to get coherent, coordinated, sustainable development in the marine environment. And we really are very keen that every effort is made to designate a properly ecologically coherent series of marine protected areas and marine European protected sites.
I don't think we're going to have time to explore that, but the eloquent arguments there allow us to recognise that as these things come round in our crowded programme in this committee, that we'll most certainly take those eloquent words on board. Claudia understands that it is part of the whole biodiversity, the rest of us do, so we will take it seriously. Thanks for the question. Right, coming back to the last short period of time that we have, I asked at the beginning about the things that you thought we could look back at from 2020 about having achieved. What's the first things that you think we have to do just now to kickstart this approach that will take us to something that's worth celebrating in 2020. And so from your organisation's point of view for delivery, what's the first things that we need to be doing in order to achieve that? Right, Alison, I think we've heard a lot about research, and clearly maybe people don't understand how much of variety of research actually goes on.
Yes, well, that's probably quite a good introduction to my point. Nobody's mentioned peatlands yet, so I'd like to mention peatlands. And I'll use that as an example of where there's some excellent integration of the best possible research knowledge that has been brought together primarily with Scottish Government funding to produce a decision support tool which will basically identify the carbon benefits of restoring any particular area of peatland versus the potential costs in other areas. And this tool has been developed. It's in the good hands of SNH now. The next step is to make it fully GIS friendly, which means anybody could use it on a computer. At the moment, it's a mixture of computer and paper. I would urge this kind of approach to biodiversity action where there's an integration of the best possible scientific knowledge, a clear identification of the uncertainties, and then action in terms of the wider cost benefits of anything, such as this example that I've given, which is peatland restoration. I think that's an excellent way to use the science to best effects, including the uncertainty, which is critical.
Well, as you know, I'm the species champion for the rusty bog moss, and I completely agree with you. All these fluffy birds and animals that people choose have got to sit on something, and therefore I think it's quite important that we do see peatlands in that direction. And the committee as a whole has taken this on board from its visits. But thank you for that focus. Davy McCracken.
Just following on from that, I mean, I appreciate, and you appreciate yourself, that there's a wide range of biodiversity that we have in Scotland, we are keen to preserve in Scotland. But reality going forward is that there's a large amount of it out there to try and actually tackle. And really, I think if we're going to make real progress by 2020, we're likely to make real progress on a smaller suite of some things rather than trying to do everything. So in answer to your question, I would be suggesting that we need to actually clearly refine what our priorities actually are, try and make sure, the peatland's been a good example there, of targeting action at some habitats that we know there will be some additional benefits from, for other species and others associated with that. But clearly know what we want to try and target, clearly have clear, achievable targets for them leading up to 2020, make sure that we use all the mechanisms we have, and from my point of view, Common Agricultural Policy and SRDP, to target appropriate actions in the right place at the right scale at those issues, and just as importantly, during this period between now and 2020, make sure we're actually monitoring how effective those actions are actually being, so that if necessary we can change things as we go forward and not wait until 2020 before we then realise that we haven't actually either not achieved what we wanted to achieve, or we don't have the information that allows us to tell us whether we've achieved what we wanted to achieve.
No more than a minute each, folks, in the order of Dave Jameson.
Okay, I'd like to go back to my original point. I'd like the government to be asking local authorities and other agencies what they're doing to meet their biodiversity duty. Anyone can put a list together, so I'd like that challenged. But I'd also like good practice to be recognised and to be shared, for us to find the strengths and weaknesses are out there, and for government to be supporting all the organisations and individuals who are involved in local authorities, in local biodiversity partnerships, to really get them onto a positive biodiversity duty track. And I'd make one further plea, and that would be to recognise and better support, by whatever means, local biological record centres, because information is the heart, increasingly at the heart, of what we need to make decisions. And I think they've been quite badly treated in the last decade.
Okay, Andrew Midgley.
I guess the context is the 2020 challenge for biodiversity is huge in terms of what we could effectively spend money on, but we have to accept that public budgets are getting smaller. We expect that the SRDP will probably be smaller next time round. We are seeing public spending cuts across the board, and that has implications for what we can deliver. So that picks up on the need for prioritisation. But the key issue that I wanted to flag was the need for alternative mechanisms, and it's about valuation, it's about continuing to explore and develop mechanisms that enable us to capture value in different ways. And so the closest initiative at the moment is the Peatland Carbon Code, which is admittedly a different agenda, but would have biodiversity benefits. So finding ways of enabling others to deliver without necessarily having to depend upon public budgets, I think, will be critical.
Much like the Forestry Code, I guess.
Yes.
Of a similar nature. Johnny Hall?
Being very simple and very blunt about it, the one-word answer I would say is bracken. We should... I won't say too much more about it. I'll let you think about that yourselves. A slightly more constructive comment, I hope, would be, I think we do have a clear opportunity, and Andrew's almost touched upon it, in terms of, whilst we've got a lot of public funding coming through agriculture, particularly in Pillar 1 of the CAP and Pillar 2, as I said earlier, both in a process of significant reform, is to have those two elements more joined up in terms of what they deliver, both in terms of the mechanisms that they use, but also in relation to some of the compliance issues. And I'll give you a very, very simple suggestion as an example. Ecological focus areas, which are part of the European Commission's proposals for greening under Pillar 1 of the CAP, all in the name of biodiversity. That's what they're being labelled as. Well, that's absolutely fine. We can absorb that into Scottish agriculture if, and I think we can do it pretty well, if we can ensure that all currently ineligible land for receipt of single farm payment were to be eligible to deliver some environmental benefit under EFAs in the future. At the moment, we're taking out eligibility of things like areas of gorse and so on and so forth being determined as being ineligible for support payments because they do not support agricultural production. Nevertheless, they do have an environmental and biodiversity value, and we should recognise that. And you extend that into farm woodlands and wet flushes and some of the seed-rich margins that Adam hankers after and so on and so forth. Let's turn those into eligible activities and integrate that into the mainstream of public support going into agriculture.
Half a minute each now. Des Thompson.
I think the great progress we've made is the conversation we're having now compared with where we were when the strategy came out. Alison touched on peatlands. The IUCN peatland programme was a huge success because it brought the researchers, the land managers and the NGOs together. We had that conversation. And that, I suggest, is what we desperately need to develop over the next 7 years to 2020. We need to be ambitious, we need to be realistic, we need to be inspirational. But looking at the different sectors, the one sector that we need to get more involved in what we're doing is the business sector. The businesses do so well out of Brand Scotland. It would be great to see if we could have some of the businesses putting a bit more back into nature to trying to help us. So that's something that would be great to see happening and reflecting on that by 2020.
Deborah Long.
Very quickly, I wanted to reflect on the fact that the decline in pollinators reflects the decline in plant diversity, and thank you to Graham for highlighting our recent report on plant diversity. Obviously, if we're going to tackle this decline, it does come down to wider land management, and we've discussed this a lot this morning, and ultimately we're talking about resources here. To be perfectly blunt, we do need to put resources into biodiversity and biodiversity conservation. SRDP, the Rural Development Scheme, is one of the options that we have for that. And it does need to be put towards buying the public good of maintaining ecosystem services, of which biodiversity is the lifeblood, if you'd like to put it like that. We need to put more money into SRDP, ideally, and we need to make sure that that money goes to the places where it's needed. So we need to make sure it goes to the right areas for the right thing. And that is one way that we can start to tackle the decline in plant diversity and the decline in pollinators and all of the impacts that's having throughout our entire environment.
Nigel Dawn.
Thank you. Thank you, Vena. Can I just come back to a point that I talked about in Parliament a couple of weeks ago? I just really want to see if I'm wrong, because it seems to me that there are so many species that we're never going to be able to do enough research There's just absolutely no way we're going to know enough about the 90,000 species that apparently live in this country. And therefore, surely biodiversity is actually dependent on habitat diversity. And we need to look after and increase the variety of habitats, even if we never know quite what is achieved, because actually we never will.
A quarter of a minute each now. Paul?
We need clearly defined biological actions and outcomes. We need those to be monitored, reported against, and we need to be responsive in terms of trends. And we need the clear definition of roles and responsibilities across government and public bodies. This needs to be explicit. And when that comes to NDPBs, that means it needs to be explicit in the grant aid letter. And when it comes to bits of government like SGRPID, it means that in the relevant delivery group of the biodiversity structures, that we have senior enough people in there that can make the decisions and that can embed biodiversity in the thinking, in the front of mind, across government departments, thereby giving that lead that business, industry, and the rest of society will follow. And I just want to say that the notion that biodiversity is somehow kind of a modern thing, that we're groundbreaking here. 5,000 years ago, the people in Orkney, the cultural significance of sea eagles is clear from the Tomb of the Eagles in South Ronaldsay. At the end of the 18th century, Robert Burns apologised to a mouse that man's dominion had broken nature's social union. The cultural significance of biodiversity in this country isn't some sort of marginal activity, and it isn't something that is a detail or an afterthought. We are up to our necks in the cultural importance of biodiversity in this country. And I think if we don't get this biodiversity strategy right, we won't be doing the country any sort of service.
That's eloquence again. Matt Shardlow.
I'm tempted to raise the spectre of the spider crawling across the cave, and I need to come at the biodiversity strategy again and again and get it right. Make sure it does work and that we do save our biodiversity, because we've heard so much today about how important it is. Important to agriculture, important to fisheries, and important to people. And it strikes me that the strategy has, in principle, lots of support and positive people wanting to see it succeed. And I think, the points have been made, I'll reiterate them again, needs clear actions, who's going to be doing what, monitoring of actions, monitoring of outcomes, where are we going to get to with the species? The species has got to be the bottom line of how well it's doing, how well it's achieving, making sure we're seeing clear advances in the habitats, and making sure that the decision makers, the local authorities and others, have this a little bit higher up their list of priorities to make sure it gets done.
And Maggie Keegan?
Okay, I can't compete with Burns, but what I will say, you won't be surprised, there's national ecological networks, it's mentioned in the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy. We need to allow our species to move around across our fragmented landscape, and we need genetic exchange between species, otherwise things can die out.
Green corridors and much more.
Exactly.
Okay, and Adam Smith and the large green areas.
Well, I'm just going to rely on my name to bring the Scottish focus. There's one for you. And I'm just going to offer three reflections. One is evidence-led conservation. We need to make sure that what we're going to do on the ground is backed by some of the research and the monitoring that justifies it. We need to intensify our conservation. Scotland's is a small, busy, crowded piece of ground already. If we're going to deliver biodiversity goods, we're going to have to choose. In a short time, 2020 is not far away, we are going to have to choose to conserve and actually manage for it. And finally, we're going to have to be adaptive and flexible. And adaptive management is going to have to become part of all of our repertoires, where we actually feed back what we have learned in short order and change what we do for the better.
I'd like to thank all of you for giving us an extremely stimulating discussion in this period. It's the beginning of our review of the biodiversity strategy, and I've no doubt we'll be meeting many of you in due course to follow up these points, and members of the committee will probably pick half a dozen of you each and follow them up. We don't have time just now, but thank you very much for your participation here. This Parliament takes the subject seriously, and I believe that all the parties in the Parliament, through the biodiversity debate that we had, showed their interest and their concern, and that this is the start of trying to firm up the ways to achieve the ends which we've talked about today. So thank you very much for being here. I'll end this part of the committee. We'll have a break so that we can leave the room and let us get on to Aquaculture and Fisheries Bill in private. But thank you very much and a safe journey.